Didn't even need to clap my hands. It seems an appropriate moment to start then. Thank you so much for being here. It's a real pleasure and an honour and a privilege to be able to introduce the inaugural lecture of Professor Fiona Cox. So a very, very warm welcome to everyone. My name is Adam Watt. I'm Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor for the Faculty of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. And so it falls to me to welcome you here on behalf of the faculty and the university, and to be a bit of a warm-up act, really. I have a very little bit of housekeeping, which is to ask that you put your phones on silent. I know this is the big ticket of the evening and there's lots of photographs need to be taken, but if we can avoid ringtones and such like during the event, that would be excellent. We've got quite a number of friends and family and colleagues joining online, so if there are things popping up on the screen, that's why. Please don't worry about that. It's all in hand. After Fiona has delivered her lecture, we won't have questions. It's normal practice to take the preparation of an edifying lecture as task enough. We don't oblige our new professors to be grilled as well. But there will be an opportunity to continue the discussion and perhaps ask difficult questions over a glass of something cold afterwards. That will be preceded by a vote of thanks by Professor Ulrike Zitzelsberger on behalf of the department. So that's what lies ahead. My task now is to introduce our speaker. Fiona Cox. It's funny doing it with you right here, isn't it? Fiona Cox is a highly accomplished and widely admired scholar of classical reception and literature in French. And if I lead with this, it's because for many years now, 7 in fact, Fiona has been in the public eye, as it were, in the department, the college, and now the faculty, as Director of Education and then as Head of Department. She's performed these roles, to which I will return, selflessly and quite brilliantly. But they may have masked for some Fiona's other identity as a leading light in her field and a major contributor to scholarly knowledge, and that side of her profile, happily, will be showcased today. Fiona was brought up in Worcestershire and educated at the Alice Otley School. She read French and Latin, winning prizes and securing a first-class degree at the University of Bristol, less said about that better, where she went on to write a PhD entitled Virgil's Presence in 20th Century French Literature. She's worked at the Université Michel de Montaigne, Bordeaux 3, as was, University College Cork for 15 years, and she came to Exeter in 2010. She was promoted to senior lecturer in 2015, associate professor in 2018, and professor in 2023. Fiona's written 3 monographs. Aeneas Takes the Metro, Virgil's Presence in 20th Century French Literature with Legenda in 1999, which remains one of my favourite monograph titles.
That's my husband.
Well done, Dick. Sibyllin Sisters, Virgil's Presence in Contemporary Women's Writing with Oxford University Press in 2011. And there's a trend here. There are lots of books followed by the words Oxford University Press, which if you're not part of the academic world is a really positive thing. Ovid's Presence in Contemporary Women's Writing, Strange Monsters, OUP 2018. And Fiona has also co-edited Homer's Daughters, Women's Responses to Homer in the 20th Century and Beyond, with Elena Theodorakopoulos, OUP 2019, and with Helena Taylor, ici présente, Ovid in French, Reception by Women from the Renaissance to the Present. You've guessed it, OUP 2023. Fiona is currently co-writing a volume contracted to OUP, entitled Modern Irish Poets and Classical Antiquity. She's published upward of 40 articles and book chapters on classical reception, on translation, on women's writing, and Victor Hugo, and is also preparing a monograph on Hugo's epic Les Misérables, which we're going to hear more about this evening. Fiona is a treasured teacher. Her undergraduate and postgraduate taught modules on Strange Monsters, on Les Misérables, on classical myth and francophone cinema attract students in considerable numbers. As long as Fiona has been head of department, despite my pleadings, it's all right, he came back. Despite my pleadings to carve out a bit more time for herself, she has continued to teach and supervise at scale, with great dedication and, it must be said, delight. She's been a sought-after external examiner of programmes at several universities and a PhD supervisor and examiner of great care and wisdom. As a director of education during COVID, Fiona was resourceful, patient, kind and unstinting in her support of others. Charles de Gaulle once questioned how anyone could govern a country with 246 varieties of cheese. A version of this challenge faces anyone who takes on the role of head of department of languages, cultures and visual studies. 7 degree level languages in countless combinations, art history and visual culture, the language centre. It's a huge job, but Fiona's calm, good-humoured approach has helped her do much to sustain a positive culture across that broad and varied community. And she's been instrumental in maintaining Exeter's position at a very challenging time for languages in HE and the wider education sector, championing new programmes and initiatives, leading on access and schools liaison work, dynamic open day and offer holder activities, and working to ensure voice, visibility and opportunities for colleagues at every career stage and job family. It's been a privilege to work with Fiona for many years now. Her invited talks have delighted audiences in recent years in Oslo, Guernsey and Rome, amongst others. And now we in Exeter have the very great pleasure to hear her speak on Les Misérables by Starlight. Fiona.
So thank you, Adam, for that characteristically kind and generous introduction, which makes it appropriate that I actually want to start with a huge debt of gratitude to Adam, who's been the most supportive, clear-sighted and compassionate academic lead over the last 7 years or so that I could imagine having. And it's a privilege and a joy to work in LCVS with so many wonderful, dedicated and talented colleagues. And a special shout out here to Steve Bassett, Katie Worth and Alison Brett, who hold things together in the department so beautifully. And of course, the department has its students at its heart. And I've learned so much from the formidable intelligence and insight of the students with whom it's been such an honour to work. I've been very lucky to supervise some outstanding PhD students. So a shout out here to Dorota Ritzka, Catherine Burke, Kathleen Hamill, Catherine Francis, Sandra Doroxy, Jada Alessandroni, Millie Marriott and Francesca Kubler. Today simply wouldn't be happening at all without the fantastic organisational skills of Zoe Bright. So I'm really grateful to her as well. And thank you enormously to all of you for being here today, both in person and online. Some debts stretch back a very long way. So when I was 14 and making my O-level selections, my father eyed my form and demanded to know why on earth I wanted to do Latin and Greek instead of the sensible choices of physics and chemistry. He said, "You'll never use Latin," he declared. And I suspect that in his heart of hearts, he still probably thinks that chemistry and physics would have been the better options. But this never stopped him supporting all of my choices, showing an interest in what I was working on and doing anything and everything he could to help me. I struck gold with my dad. And my mother, who also, I think, thought that these were the wrong choices, would have liked to be here today as well. I feel actually slightly fraudulent presenting it as a choice because I did get 21% for my last physics exam. There we go. And I'm very grateful to my lovely siblings, Philippa and David, for their support of me today as well. They're online. My first teacher of French, Jan Cowton, who taught me between the ages of 10 and 18, starting with Bonjour, culminating in A-level and looking at Hugo for S-level, gave me teaching that shaped and remained with me every day since my school days. And I was very fortunate to study at the University of Bristol just at the time when it was leading the discipline of classical receptions, and to study under and be supervised by Charles Martindale, who gave some of the most beautiful lectures I've heard. I owe a very special debt to Julie Walmsley, for her steadying wisdom, humour, and seemingly boundless kindness over the last few years. And I'm so lucky to have Eleanor Theodorakopoulos here, far more like a sister than a friend or colleague, and so lucky to have had more than 30 years of conversations and collaborations infused with her brilliance, humour, and kindness. I'm absolutely delighted that my children are here, but also that they both love Les Misérables themselves. This almost redeems the dark day when the eldest, who was then about 13, asked me, "Have you ever read a book in French?" And about half an hour later, the youngest came in, then about 11, and said, "Has anyone ever written a novelisation of of the movie of Les Misérables?" Peter and Paul, you make life brighter, richer, and funnier every day, and I couldn't be more grateful to you. And I don't know how to express my debt to my husband, Dick. You offer endless support and love, and I'd be lost without you. I'm going to start with a synopsis of Les Mis, which is not quite the Monty Python challenge of summarising à la recherche du temps perdu in a minute, but nearly. But you know, just so that we're all straight on what's happening in the plot and in the narrative. So we meet Jean Valjean on his release from prison, where he spent the last 19 years. His initial crime was to steal a loaf of bread to feed his sister's starving children, and his sentence was extended after various attempts to escape. By the time he leaves prison, he's a hardened criminal, convinced of the wrongs and thefts perpetrated upon him by society. Marked out by his convict's yellow passport, he has difficulty finding lodging, but is taken in by a saintly bishop. He repays the bishop by stealing his silver candlesticks. No, he doesn't. He steals all the other silver and he runs away. And when he's brought back to the bishop's house for questioning by the police, the bishop claims to have given him the silverware and then hands over the candlesticks as well to Jean Valjean. And once the police have left, he tells the criminal that he's bought his soul with the silver and given it to good. But spiritual transformations are only possible through individual agency, so it's not enough for the bishop to have made the decision for him. Off Valjean goes to steal a silver coin from a small boy, Petit Gervais, before looking in horror at the mean-spirited bully he's become. At this turning point, Valjean is reborn and is able to establish a new identity for himself. He becomes a highly respectable bourgeois mayor called Monsieur Madeleine, reputed for his philanthropy and charitable acts. It's in this guise that he takes care of the dying prostitute Fantine and promises to wrest her daughter Cosette from out of the clutches of the grasping, heartless Thénardier with whom she's housed, and to bring her up himself. Circumstances demand that he denounce himself in court as the former convict Jean Valjean, and a cat and mouse chase ensues between Valjean and the rigid authoritarian policeman Javert. Valjean escapes with Cosette into a convent where they remain until she's a young woman. Javert continues to hound Valjean almost to the closing pages of the book. But when Valjean displays to Javert the redemptive power of forgiveness, Javert is unable to cope with a world that is governed by divine law rather than human law and throws himself into the Seine. In the meantime, Cosette falls in love with the young student Marius. He's left a wealthy home to become a Democrat. He rejects the conservative views of his grandfather and embraces the ideals of his dead father, a Napoleonic general. Marius is wounded fighting on the barricades during the June Revolution in 1832, in the same event where Gavroche, the lovable urchin and son of the Thénardier, is killed. Although Valjean hates Marius, who poses a threat to his quietly contented future with Cosette, he nevertheless retrieves his unconscious body from the barricades and carries him to safety. This necessitates a descent into the sewers of Paris, which is one of the most vivid and mythically charged episodes of the book even. Once they emerge, Valjean leaves the unconscious Marius at his grandfather's house and disappears unrecognized. Shortly afterwards, with Marius and his family still believing that Valjean is simply Cosette's respectable father, his grandfather consents happily to Marius's marriage to Cosette. After the wedding, Valjean reveals his identity and status as an ex-convict to Marius, who doesn't yet realize that it was Valjean who saved him from the barricades. Marius is appalled and agrees to Valjean's offer to withdraw gradually from their lives. Eventually, Marius finds out the truth and there's a reconciliation, but Valjean has been mortally stricken by the loss of Cosette and is dying. And now we'll get down to business. My aim in analysing Starlight in Les Misérables is not simply to look at the importance of stars, to the constant interplay between light and shadow, which is a trademark of Hugo's writing, nor to focus exclusively on what we can glean about different characters' psychological states from their responses to Starlight, but also to think about how Hugo uses star imagery to insert himself into a tradition of literary epic and to assert his literary immortality. Stars both illumine and darken the entirety of Les Misérables, and this has been identified by the librettists Vugli and Kretzmer in the musical. The presence or absence of stars on many occasions indicates to the reader the emotional and spiritual state of the characters and alert us to the glimpses of heaven and hell that they are experiencing. The first appearance of stars establishes this, I was meant to do a screen thing, establishes the tensions between heaven and hell in a typically pathetic manner. So I'll have the French and the English up on all of the slides as we go through, and I won't read the citations out. But right from the start, the spiritual perspectives of the protagonists, and by extension Hugo's readers, are challenged. Mud, the matter of the gutters, is made beautiful by the traces of stupid waddling birds. In this work of revolution, in which the people of the gutter strive to establish a new world, their own utopia, everything is vulnerable to being overturned. It's actually in snow, but it was prettier than the ones that were in mud, so there we are. And just as significantly, while Hugo shows us these stars etched in mud, he reminds us that the stars that illumine his epic of the 19th century borrow their light from classical epic, from Homer, Dante, and Milton, and from the Bible. And in the best epic tradition, he declares that he will surpass his predecessors. This new work, this superior epic, will change our view of the constellations of literary epic leading up to this point and enable us to view them with fresh eyes. There's an awful lot going on in this passage. By naming his predecessors, Homer, Milton, and Dante, and bringing them all together like this, Hugo is creating an episode that parallels Dante's meeting of his significant forebears at the start of the Inferno, when Dante and Virgil meet Homer, Ovid, Horace, and Lucan. Furthermore, it's a standard epic trope to imply or declare that this new work will surpass those that have gone before. So here you have him claiming, that if you were going to write the poem of the human conscience, which is what he's doing with Les Misérables, then you would be melding all epics into one superior epic, the epic to end all. It's also a very typical Hugo maneuver. You won't spend long in his company before realizing that false modesty is not part of his makeup at all. And it's telling that Hugo uses that adjective définitive because it suggests that Les Misérables is the end point of epic. And if we fail to pick up on that point here, he reinforces it later in the book, where one of the fighters on the barricades, a black man, is named Omer Ogu, the start and the culmination of the epic journey. And this is a point to which I shall return towards the end of the lecture. This passage is Hugo's direct response to Milton's assertion in Paradise Lost that he too was embarking upon, quote, things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. And the declaration that the most apparently insignificant human being carries elements of Homer's Odyssey, of Milton's Paradise Lost, and Dante's Commedia within them is also a democratization of those epics, and that's a byproduct of Les Misérables. And the fact that Hugo fuses classical epic with the lowliest of human beings is a marker of his Christianizing of this epic. Epic is no longer the preserve of war heroes, kings, and canonical poets, but it belongs to the humblest of human beings. Hugo explicitly links the ability to kindle starlight within the bleakest of places, the darkest of souls, to his readings of classical and biblical authors. And he describes, oh, should have seen that before. There towards the end, you've got all of the Homer, Milton, Dante bit. And here you have the section where he describes the abysses that are Lucretius, St. Paul, and Dante, and so on. And this act of contemplation, the ability to bring into being a host of galaxies through a process of spiritual meditation, is precisely the act that Udo depicts in his poem Le Mendiant, which means the beggar, published in Les Contemplations in 1856. The figure of the beggar becomes the figure of the humblest human being, caught in the act of contemplation that Hugo depicts above. The story depicted in the poem of a beggar granted shelter and kindness on a cold evening anticipates Jean Valjean's welcome to the house of the bishop, but it also glances at the figure of the saintly Monsieur Mabeuf, as we shall see. He's a secondary character, because this mendiant is a hermit whose days are spent meditating upon spiritual matters and concentrating upon improving the lot of humanity. The firelight that glows through the holes of his ragged blue coat transforms the tattered clothes of the wretched into a vision of stars. And this is actually something Hugo used to do. He used to like to sit in front of the fire, spreading out his blankets and looking at the light peeping through the holes there. The flowering of constellations from the most unpromising of materials anticipates comparable imagery in Les Misérables, but it also looks back to the world of Dante's Commedia. Behind Les Contemplations, as well as behind Les Misérables, stands Dante's medieval epic of a journey from hell to paradise, structured by the stars that denote an emergence from hell. So you see there that the first part of the Commedia, the Inferno, closes with Dante mounting up, Dante and Virgil, he first, I the second, till I beheld through a round aperture some of the beauteous things that heaven doth bear. Thence we came forth to behold the stars, and then Purgatorio, similarly, with newborn foliage immaculate, eager to rise, now ready for the stars. And then in Paradise, where we have the vision of absolute harmony, the heavenly utopia that Hugo wants to create on earth, everything is bound together within the love that turns the sun and the other stars. Les Misérables doesn't follow the same linear structure as the Commedia. Rather, its characters experience glimpses of heaven and sojourns in hell. Among the many debts that Hugo owes to Dante, however, is the use of star imagery to depict situations that are the closest we can experience of heaven on earth. When Hugo portrays the godly life of the bishop, Monseigneur Bienvenu, he's the one who gave Jean Valjean his candlesticks, he focuses upon the activities of gardening, contemplation, and stargazing, as we see there. And that's an illustration of the bishop in his garden. Basically, if Hugo wants you to think well of someone, they're very, very good at gardening. This is one of the things that goes through. And it's heartening to see the growth of eco-critical readings of Les Misérables by scholars such as Karen Quant and Florence Nogrette. But it's rare for Hugo to allow his readers a vision of such loveliness without ensuring that somewhere in the book will appear as its pendant a scene in which the heavenly ideal cruelly taunts the book's characters by remaining elusively and tantalizingly out of reach. Monseigneur Bienvenu disappears from the narrative relatively early on, but his qualities shine out in this secondary character, the humble, gentle figure of Monsieur Mabeuf, the church warden who was the one to tell Marius about his father, all about his father, and the one to overturn Marius's political allegiances. Monsieur Mabeuf also spends his days trying to do good, gardening and reading. But he becomes one of the Misérables himself, and little by little he loses everything. His garden fails, he sinks into poverty, and he's forced to sell off his books one after the other. Even when he receives help in the form of a purse heavy with coins, which is thrown over the wall as a gift, and the benefactor is Jean Valjean, the simplicity and integrity of his heart makes him incapable of accepting this unexpected boon because he cannot identify its provenance. The gold which falls from heaven and which is presented not only as a gift from the stars, but as metamorphosed stars itself, falls dead within the garden because Mabeuf is temperamentally unable to use it. And as my son Paul pointed out to me, Valjean is here performing the role of Saint Nicholas, who was also, his trademark gesture was leaving anonymous gifts of money, which I haven't known. And the passage here is a dark and saddened version of the metamorphosed coin that Cosette finds shining in her shoe on Christmas morning, self a spiritual echo of the stars over Bethlehem, a coin that had been placed there by Jean Valjean when he was rescuing her from the Thénardier. And the coin given to Cosette also recalls and redeems the coin stolen from Petit Gervais at the point of Jean Valjean's conversion. But the passage in which Mabeuf has become too weak to pull water from the well in order to nourish his garden is made crueler by the way in which it looks back to the bishop's life of bliss. And you know, there the stars are taunting him. Towards the end, you have stars everywhere, thought the old man, not the merest wisp of a cloud, not the tiniest drop of water. And it's worth noting that this passage, of course, also looks forward to the despair of Marcel Pagnol's Jean de Florette, who also loses everything because of this lack of water. Mabeuf's misery is highlighted not just by the way in which this scene carries echoes of the bishop's happier activities, but by the fact that even as poverty strips him of everything, Cosette and Marius are experiencing the bliss of new love in the setting of a garden illumined by stars. In stark contrast to the wretchedly parched earth of Mabeuf's garden, the garden where Cosette and Marius meet is richly fertile and starred with flowers. And the presentation of this garden also carries some heartbreaking parallels with the early presentation of Fantine, Cosette's mother, running through the Parisian gardens like the statue of Galatea. And there we have the dew-like pearls, and pearls were a big feature of Fantine. Her teeth were likened to pearls, but they were the very elements that she was selling off in order to pay for Cosette. Hugo shows us the beauty that Cosette is able to take from the earthly matter of the garden before she enters into an appreciation of a more cosmic love that derives from her burgeoning love of Marius. So the passage falls into two halves, marking the transition between Cosette as a little girl playing with insects and Cosette as a woman ready to love Marius. And when Cosette and Marius fall in love, they themselves are represented as stars, bound together by a gaze infused by human love, which itself is a reflection of divine love. Paradoxically, the more human one allows oneself to become through loving, the closer one comes to the divine world. And the way in which this scene echoes imagery from Paradise Lost not only embeds Les Misérables further within this epic tradition, but it also thereby portrays Cosette and Marius as 19th century exemplars of Adam and Eve, experiencing perfect, pristine love in an idyllic garden, but destined to be tested and to fail later in the book. The glories of the natural world are as nothing unless they are brought to life with the breath of love and human connection. And as Hugo shows character after character becoming more and more human as they gaze at the stars, he echoes Ovid's account of the beginning of the world at the start of his Metamorphoses. So Ovid claims while other animals looked downwards at the ground, he gave human beings an upturned aspect, commanding them to look towards the skies and upright raise their face to the stars. Although Hugo readily acknowledges his debt to Homer, Virgil, Dante, Milton, and the Bible in Les Misérables, he never comments on the Ovidian influence that pervades a book that is obsessed with metamorphosis. Just look at the way in which Valjean's purse metamorphoses from gold coins to a shower of stars before coming to rest as a mass of dead metal, or the different identities shared by the characters, most notably Jean Valjean, but characters like Fantine also assume the identities of mythical forebears such as Galatea. Characters become ghosts and statues, as well as the embodiment of earlier literary characters. But Hugo hated Ovid. He said, "Je n'aime pas Ovid." I really don't like Ovid. And he dismissed him as ce proscrit lâche, which is this cowardly exile. And it may be because Hugo and Ovid both shared the experience of exile and their very different responses to banishment. So Hugo sort of wrote most of Les Misérables and published it from the Channel Islands. He was on Guernsey, and Ovid was banished to Tomis. And Hugo was quite punchy about it. You know, he was railing and raging against Napoleon III. And Ovid wept and you know, kept sort of sending rather craven letters back to Augustus, begging to be allowed to return to Rome. And this may have cost him his place in Hugo's first rank of geniuses, which we have here. These are the writers, he claims, illumine the darkness of a benighted humanity, and whom he depicts as a constellation of stars at the end of his book, William Shakespeare, which is actually an extended meditation on the nature of genius. So you've got that long, long list there, and they're both mythical and real. On and on he goes, broadly chronological. And I will just point out that you are an extremely impolite reader of Hugo if you aren't mentally supplying his name at the end there, somewhere, you know, between Washington and Jesus Christ. He does expect that. But that abundance of names from the ancient world makes the absence of Ovid even more striking. Ironically, he stands behind Hugo's imagery of great minds transfigured into stars, since he famously refused the idea of death, declaring at the end of the Metamorphoses that he would live on in fame, taking his rightful place among the stars as a consequence of his literary genius. So the parallels between Ovid's assertion and Hugo's constellation can't, I think, be brushed aside, however much Hugo might like to erase all mention of him. And this is particularly the case, given that Hugo seeks throughout his oeuvre to position France and Paris as the new cultural centre of the world, the Rome of the 19th century, for which he is the mouthpiece. And Hugo uses this image of the constellations to indicate the influences upon Marius also, as Marius's political allegiances shift and change, and he rejects his grandfather's royalism in favour of his father's republicanism, the heroes of the past appear to him as constellations, offering guidance to those navigating a course through the turbulence and tumult of 19th century French history. So there you've got all of those stars: Misérables, Vergniaud, Saint-Just, Robespierre, Camille Desmoulins, Danton, and culminating with the sunrise of Napoleon. But stars are just as often felt as absent in Les Misérables, and their lack is felt acutely by the characters who look for the consolation of their light and find themselves abandoned. The first time we meet Jean Valjean, as he's giving up on the hope of finding shelter, food, and some form of human contact, he catalogues his misfortunes, which culminate in the lack of starlight, as if even the heavens have turned their back upon him. So he was in the dog kennel, and the dog bit him and chased me away like it was a man. Off he goes to the fields to sleep under the stars, but there aren't any stars. And similarly, at the point where he experiences utter despair while deciding whether to condemn himself to life imprisonment in order to free the innocent Champmathieu in court, or whether he must damn his soul by living a lie, the sky is plunged into absolute darkness. Again, we're told, il n'y avait pas d'étoile au ciel. Unable to receive any kind of guidance from the heavens, Valjean falls asleep and has a terrifying dream that challenges his existential integrity. And when he awakes, he focuses yet again upon the lack of starlight. Off he goes to the window, and there aren't any stars. As he works through his terrible dilemma, he breathes in what Dante calls the starless air of hell. He's experiencing what appears to be the end of his world, a spiritual state in which, as Milton put it, there is no light but only darkness visible. Yet Valjean's experience is soothed by this Christian promise that the close of earthly life simply opens to the door to this love that turns the sun and the other stars. Hugo gestures at this, even as Valjean wrestles with himself for the survival of his soul. His thoughts turn to the figure of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night before the crucifixion, when there was still time for him to make a choice that would entail him evading his death. And there you have that image of the streaming shadow running over with darkness in the star-filled depths. Such a blend of deepest darkness and sheets of stars softens the imagery of the blackest night that falls on the day of Valjean's death. We first met him seeking shelter on a starless night, and the final scene of the book echoes this. We're told that, again, la nuit était sans étoiles et profondément obscure. Prior to Valjean's death, during his withdrawal from Cosette's life because of her developing relationship with Marius, I can never quite forgive Cosette for this, I have to say. Anyway, he's occasionally blessed by glimpses of starlight, which we see there. Hugo expands this image to depict the way in which heavenly peace enables a flowering of stars within a human soul. And he coins that beautiful reflexive verb, s'étoiler, sort of breaking into stars, which is there at the bottom of the slide there. The soul twinkles like stars. All of these translations are by Julie Rose. I should have pointed that out. The glimmers of light that visit Valjean perhaps allow us to see cracks in the darkness of his grief. And there we see him walking towards Cosette's house. He stands outside, la tête tendue en avant, ne voyant rien, n'entendant rien. There are irresistible echoes here of Hugo's most famous poem, depicting his own pilgrimage to his daughter's grave, which is entitled Demain dès l'aube. And given the importance of Dante to Hugo's oeuvre as a whole, the image of walking through starlight to find lost loved ones in paradise is perhaps not too fanciful. And the characters of Les Misérables contend not only with the absence of stars, but also on occasion with malign stars. It's notable that the outbreak of violence on the barricades is indicated by that reflexive verb again, s'étoiler, so where the window pane is shattered into stars. The glass shattering through violence is counterbalanced by the depiction of one of the revolutionaries, Enjolras, standing heroically on the barricades, a composite figure of angel, lion, and human crowned with stars. The glory of the heavenly vision that is Enjolras at this moment is shadowed by his impending death. Once more, this darkness is anticipated by Paradise Lost, where in a story that Jean Valjean reverses, Lucifer turns from angel to devil and is pictured falling from heaven like a star. So there we're told, sphere o'er the battlements, from morn to noon he fell, from noon to dewy eve, a summer's day, and with the setting sun dropped like from the zenith like a falling star. And it's notable that this is an image taken up by Herbert Kretzmer in the English version of the song Stars in Les Misérables, which likens Valjean to Lucifer. Furthermore, when Valjean undergoes his crisis of conscience on that starless night when he must decide whether to denounce himself and release Champmathieu from life imprisonment, he perceives the reddish light of hell approaching him in the eerie glow of the lanterns on the carriage he's ordered, which I'll just find here. And it's unsurprising also that Javert's presence should also be heralded by the appearance of a malign star. Just as the arrival of the carriage to take him to Arras marks the first stage of a possible descent into hell, so the appearance of Javert casts a sickly light that heralds a possible future damnation. As Valjean peers anxiously through a crack in the door to see if he's being pursued, his heart sinks as he beholds Javert's distinctive light. This single dark star multiplies into a host of reddish, sinister stars that pursue Valjean through the streets of Paris later in the book, as he runs away from the barricades in order to save Marius and ends up descending into the sewers of Paris, Hugo's vision of hell. And there you've got that image of a spider. Readers of Notre Dame de Paris or the Hunchback of Notre Dame may recall the chilling depiction of the spider that represents an inexorable and unkind fate. Small wonder then that these stars should pursue Valjean into the bowels of hell. And that sense of being watched by something inanimate yet hostile looks back once again to that awful night of the conscience wrestling, when the coin stolen from Petit Gervais appeared to gaze at him impassively and unrelentingly, like the eye of his conscience. And let's not forget that that night also ended with the lanterns of the carriage flickering at him like red stars. And in this passage, oh no, it's the one down at the bottom there, beginning behind him. In the passage below, the image of a light that pursues you everywhere, no matter how hard you attempt to escape, looks ahead to the terror of being caught in 20th century searchlights and reminds us of how easily Patrick Modiano, who's all of his writing really is thinking through the Holocaust and the impact of the Holocaust sort of on Paris and on individuals. But in his book Dora Bruder, he's able to calque the story of Les Misérables onto the stories of individual Jews fleeing the Nazis and collaborators through the streets of war-torn Paris. This phantasmagoria of shadows and stars marks Valjean's descent into hell, a hell that is darkened further through the memories that it carries of Milton's fiery wastes or of the journey undertaken by Dante and Virgil. And yet I began this lecture with the image of the stars etched into the mud by the feet of waddling ducks. Before depicting the ways in which the shining or eclipses of stars shape the fortunes or shade the mental attitudes of the protagonists who forge their destinies on a planet wheeling through space, Hugo uses star imagery to depict the beauty found among the filthy and the dispossessed. I'm going backwards now. Try that again. That's the one I want. The children of the gutter are illiterate, have developed their own language, and it's a language blistered by obscenities and light years away from the stately measures of writers such as Dante and Milton. The world of classical epic does not belong to them. It does not speak of the likes of them, and the poor had no access to such texts. But Hugo's metamorphosis of the tradition of classical epic means that it has pivoted towards sheltering the dispossessed, the wretched of the earth. Even before Jean Valjean makes his iconic descent into the sewer, Hugo gave us Gavroche, the prototype of the cheerful Parisian urchin who redeemed his soiled existence every single day by remaining open to beauty and the possibility of beholding the stars. And here Hugo describes this archetypal Parisian urchin in a passage that begins "C'est être braille, raille, gouaille, bataille." He emphasizes the roughness of the language, all of those harsh I endings. As my husband points out, this actually apparently carries the flavor of Guernsey French, those I sounds. But it's a language that is also transformed into heavenly paeans. It's a language that moves from street slang, and Hugo expands at length upon slang in the book, to the Latin terms familiar to everyone from church. And this is important because Hugo is demonstrating here the transformative power of education. And in one of the best books written about Les Misérables, David Bellos argues that Hugo's frequent insertion of Latin tags and phrases means that, and here I'm quoting him, he says, Les Misérables almost teaches you how to read Latin. Why should a novel about the poor and downtrodden try to do that? The answer was much more obvious 150 years ago than it is today. Learning Latin helped its first readers take a step towards the light. Knowledge of the language of Rome had been the distinguishing feature of the educated classes for more than 1,000 years. The mass schooling that Hugo wanted would teach people to read and write first of all, but from mass literacy would come an elite able to enjoy the cultural riches he himself had lapped up as a boy. That's the end of the citation. So this passage depicting the urchin is, I think, a pendant to the passage where Hugo declares his epic intentions and claims that the works of Homer, Milton, and Dante speak of the humblest of humans. And the image of the urchin squatting to defile Olympus before singing his own song is a declaration that the future of this epic can only be assured if it speaks of those and for those who have to date been left out of literature. For Hugo's poetic nom de plume was Olympio. And in this regard, it's surely significant that Hugo characterizes Homer as, he calls him l'énorme poète enfant, the great child poet, which I think is not just looking back to the birthplace of epic, but also suggesting the urgency of incorporating a child's perspective. Further, this metaphorical fouling of dominant literary values offers an interesting parallel to the fight Hugo spearheaded against classicism when he was a young romantic. As the urchin squats in filth to emerge in stars, he foreshadows Valjean's journey through the sewers, from which he emerges into a starlit Parisian evening. In Hugo's hands, classical epic tells the story of the poor. In Les Misérables, the language of the gutters, the dirt of the sewers, is hallowed by the breath of humanity and transfigured into the Song of the Stars. There's Hugo's slightly disturbing sketch of Gavroche. He was a prolific artist as well as everything else, and actually there is an exhibition of his painting and drawing at the Royal Academy of Arts till June the 26th, if anyone wants to explore that further. But he opened his work by ensuring its immortality. The Préface to Les Misérables argues that the work will retain its relevance for as long as poverty scars civilization. Hugo knows that these problems won't be eradicated. The work, envisaged as the Bible of the 19th century, is declaring in its own way that the poor will always be with us. I asked you earlier to remember Hugo's insertion of a name bestowed upon the only black man in the book, Omer Ogu. There it is. It's not subtle. You know, he wants you to think of it as Omer, Hugo, the beginning and end points of the epic tradition. Bear in mind once again that Hugo conceived of his book as the épopée définitive, the epic to end all epics. And remember how Les Misérables ushers through its pages the epics of Homer, Dante, Milton and Ovid, while simultaneously asserting its importance as the epic of the future through a préface that claims that it will always be relevant. It's enormously significant that Hugo gives his name to the character most vulnerable to being outcast, not only through poverty, but also through the colour of his skin. He was a vociferous and active abolitionist at this time. And I think he would be very, very interested in all of the plethora of adaptations and responses to Les Misérables that there have been, but perhaps particularly interested in the 2019 film, Les Misérables by Lajli. This film shows us Montfermeil of the 21st century, no longer the rustic setting of the Thénardiers' inn, but a banlieue simmering with tension, housing those who most risk feeling excluded from having a stake in French society. This is the community in which Lee grew up. As the police visit, they comment on the level of prostitution there, indicating that women are still forced to sell themselves to survive. Ironically, the school is named after Victor Hugo, but its pupils overwhelmingly fail to achieve social mobility and are doomed to continue the lives of poverty of their parents. Gavroche is transformed into a young boy, Issa, who himself is injured by the forces of law and order. There's only one direct citation from Hugo in the film, and it appears as a postscript. So, mes amis, retenez ceci, il n'y a ni mauvaises herbes, ni mauvais hommes, il n'y a que de mauvais cultivateurs. Lajli's Les Misérables horrified Emmanuel Macron, who immediately ordered an investigation into poverty in the banlieue, creating an interesting parallel with the impact of Hugo's novel, which changed the parliamentary agenda in France for 1862. But in recent weeks, Kemi Badenoch has scoffed at the idea of fiction playing a part in parliamentary business. In his inaugural lecture on Hugo a couple of weeks ago, Bradley Stevens pointed out that Hugo gives us lots of ammunition for that question that keeps being asked: why bother teaching literature? Hugo understood that fiction can, indeed must, have the power to change attitudes, to change the world. And this does indeed offer one facet of the value of the humanities, of teaching our students to exercise the imaginative and empathetic imperative of placing themselves in the worlds of others. It's striking how powerfully the themes of his book map onto the values of our university as we strive collectively to promote the ideals of the society we seek to shape. The story of Les Misérables continues to grow, and in doing so to demand a fairer, healthier and greener society. And Hugo's writing continues to invite us to accompany him as we seek to pursue the university's motto, Seguimos lucha, we follow the light. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much on behalf of all of us for this wonderful talk, illuminating talk about light and stars, and by implication also literature and education. And I think this sums up actually your passions. So this is a match made in heaven. You go, thank you. So you really had to come together. Thank you so much. Many years ago, in 2021, 21, in the dark days of the pandemic, when everything had to be very sheltered and with face masks, in this very room, we actually had an open day. And
We did.
Indeed. We did everything we had to do. We were saying all the right things about how wonderful the languages are and how well we work in educating the students. And then the night before, we had found out we should also give an impassionate talk about our favorite research. And you talked at the time about the film adaptations, which is, it sounds now like a follow-up that potentially is possible. I want to go back to what Adam said in the beginning, that DOE sometimes might have masked you all of a researcher. The researcher that day really came out in force, and it was, people were really spellbound listening to Fiona, as we have been in the past 45, 50 minutes. Thank you so much. And outside are liquids to make questions easier, and congratulations even more. And there's also, I understand, some nibbles. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.